Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the RCYP webinar series. Before I introduce the team, I just wanted to talk a little about the Rights for Children and Youth Partnership Project. It is an international interdisciplinary research project that looks at the factors that supports or hinders the rights and protections of children in 7 different countries, including Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and their diaspora populations in Canada. So there's 5 major themes of the project, which include policies, social media, violence, institutional practices, and immigration dynamics. And so under the theme, the umbrella theme of institutional practices, there are 3 different institutions that we look at, which include the judicial system, the child protection system, and the education system, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my team and myself. So my name is Veronica Escobar. I am the project coordinator at the Ryerson-based team for the Rights for Children and Youth Partnership Project. I have Rhiema Shuster. Rhiema is a 4th-year student in the School of Social Work and a research assistant with the project. Kadeem Brown, who is a 4th-year Child and Youth Care student and research assistant. And lastly, we have Cheung, who is a Master's of Social Work student at the University of Toronto and a research assistant. So why don't we go ahead and get started with talking about so far what we've explored regarding the education system and the experiences of Latinx and Caribbean youth in the education system. So as you guys all know, we have interviewed youth, parents, and educators of the education system. So why don't we start with talking about what are the major themes that we've explored?
So one of the things that we're seeing with lack of representation is how it really creates a disconnect between students and teachers and their fellow peers, a disconnect between parents and other parents and the teachers, and a disconnect between the educators and their team members in supporting young Black and Latin students. So what we're seeing because of this disconnection is that students don't necessarily feel engaged with their classmates or their teachers. We're seeing that parents don't necessarily feel engaged in the school community and able to advocate or really just keep up with what's going on in their kids' classrooms. And we're seeing that teachers really are on their own in supporting these students if they don't have a supportive network in their school systems as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at the way that a lack of representation is affecting like each sort of, I don't want to say like group, but like community differently. Like the youth are largely impacted by the lack of a teacher that represent them. I know that like when we were talking to youth, the youth would talk about how they could probably go through their entire education without ever having encountered a Latinx teacher. And the youth who did encounter a Latinx teacher told us that they often felt like more connected, like an instant connection to these teachers, even though, you know, they might not necessarily be from the same countries or like speak the language, although the language did help, but it was just a connection based on, you know, having someone that they could identify with.
I had a parent who actually was mentioning how having more representation of Black and Latinx youth was actually helpful for their navigation of the education system, especially when they just came to Canada and are not familiar with the education system, because they found that Latinx teachers or Caribbean teachers were able to be more empathetic to the context of the students' learning environment and are able to provide more resources that other teachers may not if they didn't have that lived experience.
Yeah, and again, I think just that the underrepresentation, it really hurts the youth. It really hurts the Black and Latinx youth because coming into if you're immigrating coming into a new country, you want to look for kind of familiar stuff and again, we see that all through the transcripts and all through our research that there's a need for that. There's a need for that connection. There's a need for that relationship, and it's not there within the schools right now.
Yeah, and you can see sort of patterns of how this is like affecting the development of youth. I've had a few interviews of youth who immigrated here after having been born in a different country, and they immigrated to Canada at younger age, or at older ages rather, and like 9, 10, and you could see like parents and would describe, you know, how the youth would, they went from very talkative youths to all of a sudden like just they wouldn't speak, like they, it was almost like it changed their personalities, not being able to communicate with anyone, not being able to, you know, share their culture with anyone. This is specifically, I'm thinking about youth who didn't come or came with a different language rather. But and even the youth themselves would talk about, I remember one specific youth was telling us how, you know, it was really affecting, it was having a negative consequence on his mental health, because he would go from 9 to 3 without speaking to anyone literally all day. And it was super hard for him. And even parents are noticing, like I've had a few parents who described their children that they were very lively before coming to Canada. They were very talkative, and all of a sudden they don't speak. They hate school. They cry. They don't want to go to school. And I think it's very traumatic for a lot of the youth.
And in a similar vein, I've heard parents and students as well say that part of that disconnection, it feeds into how they engage with the curriculum and the work that they're doing at school, where they feel like just because you're not represented, there's that added layer of feeling disconnected from what they're learning about, whether it be in like social studies or history or something like that. It's a bigger barrier than just the immediate school environment. It's about kind of complementing the different cultures and I guess expectations for school as well.
Mm-hmm.
And also, right, like looking back at it and that connection, there's no common ground. There's going to be that disconnect because having the representation helps with lived experiences. It helps with understanding problems and understanding maybe struggles and barriers that those children might be going through, and the underrepresentation doesn't help that. So it continues to feed that problem within these structures.
Yeah, 100%. Like when we would talk to racialized teachers, they were able to like emotionally connect and understand their youth in ways that maybe, you know, white educators might not, or, you know, like have just at least like the knowledge to, or empathy rather, I should say, the empathy to understand that like maybe I don't fully understand where this child is coming from, but there's a difference in experience, and there's a difference in the learning. And I think that what ended up happening was a lot of additional labor that racialized teachers have to do and have to undertake, because, you know, a lot of them got into the education system, at least based on our interviews, a lot of them got into the education system wanting to help youth. And so what ends up happening is they do a lot of additional labor, you know, like going above and beyond the call of duty, making certain exceptions for students that, like, while not necessarily wrong, they're not written into the curriculum, they're not written into what a teacher is supposed to be doing, but they do it anyways.
So I actually had a teacher who was talking about how their school had diversity workshops to attend, and it was completely optional for all the staff from the school to go to, but only herself and the principal showed up. But she found those workshops very important to incorporate in the curriculum to diversify them and to make it less Eurocentric, so students feel like they matter and students feel like they can make a difference in the world and actually belong in education. So for example, she would include important contributions from important figures from Black history. But it was really upsetting to hear how teachers might not necessarily put in that additional effort to try to engage students like that, or to try to be more inclusive of those different histories from different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even looking back at some of the teachers we interviewed and looking back at the research, a common factor that a lot of black students are being suspended and expelled And in these alternative programs, there's still a lack of representation of Black teachers in those schools. So in like the caring and safe schools, there's a lack of representation at those schools to kind of help problem solve and help again build relationship with these students.
Yeah, I think, you know, that those two themes might seem unconnected, like, you know, students getting expelled or suspended, and how, like, what does representation have to do with that? But you can see that, like, when we spoke to teachers who, specifically Black teachers, when they were talking about Black students, they would talk about how they understood first how Black students were, you know, being unfairly seen by other educators because they themselves might have been through the same process, and secondly because they sort of understood the situation. I had one guidance counselor who, you know, talked about how, like, one particular student was being sort of pushed out because they had they were what she described as like a ghost student. And so rather than, you know, just like cross their name off the list as mandate dictates, you know, she went above and beyond and to see, like, where was the student, what was going on. And there was a lot of personal issues going on in this child's life. But, you know, without the care and without the knowledge, some educators just simply would have probably crossed their name off the list. So we've talked a little bit about, you know, lack of representation, and I think that we've touched on how this affects advocacy, but I think that maybe we should delve a little bit more into advocacy for children, you know, children and youth, like the youth themselves, the parents, and the teachers.
I'm just going back from the research. It seems like from educational standpoint that we need more advocacy, and it has to be with the student. I'm seeing a lot of programs that are being placed from the research being put in place by the board or by the higher ups. I'm not sure exactly who's putting them in place, but it's not with the students. The students are not really voicing these opinions. It's whatever the school thinks these students need without hearing from these students. And that's from just a bunch of different interviews that I've been able to go over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think also, in addition to, like, students being left out of the conversation, parents are left out of the conversation a lot. I've heard a lot about parents, you know, wanting more of a community feel from the education system and just sort of feeling left out. For Latinx parents specifically, or maybe not specifically, but in the ones that we've talked to, the language is a huge deal. Not knowing English or not knowing sufficient English to understand, or even having like a background of knowledge in the education system. Like, parents just don't know what they can and cannot advocate for their children, and that has been very difficult both on the children. The youth have talked about, you know, how their parents not being able to help them has impacted the level of education they receive or the services they receive or they know that they can receive, and the parents as well have expressed how they are impacted by not knowing how they can help their children.
I've heard similar things from Black and Caribbean parents as well, like really, really wishing there was a community aspect to the education system, really wishing that there was more personalized communication between parents and teachers. And even before their child needs any additional support or there's any sort of conflict in the school, I've heard parents just say that they wish that they even knew what their children were learning, and that they didn't have to wait until, you know, parent-teacher interviews or those checkpoints during the school year. And it just seems to be, it just seems to make it a lot harder for some parents to, again, know how to advocate for their children when they don't really know what's going on in the school. And they're really only hearing the bits and pieces that are coming home at the end of the school day.
I think I actually had, I think parents they want to be involved in their children's education. And when they see that struggle occurring, they really want to advocate. At times, they experience a barrier where the school board isn't really willing to maybe collaborate with them or work with them. For example, I had a few parents who discussed how they came in for a meeting, but they found that there was racism going on, or when they hear an accent, they assume like the parents are kind of dumber than they are.
Yeah, like they assume intelligence level.
Yeah, exactly. And that really impacts their experiences, because the school board isn't really actually willing to listen to what the parent has to say, or the recommendations or feedback that the parent has to offer. And sometimes when there's a language barrier going on, the school board even neglects to offer them a translator or offer them the right to have an advocate with them, unless the parent really persists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think even again, like there's so much cases where a lot of Latinx parents come into the school board and they're unaware of the resources that they have. The school doesn't teach them or educate them about the resources that they have. So even again, what Rachel was speaking about the translator, the school doesn't even tell them or teach them that every time you come in, if you don't have if you don't have a translator, we'll provide one. But that's not really common knowledge, and it should be, because it's a barrier that is just not being broken.
Mm-hmm. And it leads you to very wide repercussions. Sorry, Rachel, go ahead.
I also found that when parents have a background in in working with the education system, or working with children, for example, like child and youth workers, if they have a background in that, they're more likely to advocate for their children because they know the system. But it's really disappointing how they need that background in order to know how to navigate the system, when that knowledge should already be given to parents when their children access the education system at first.
Yeah, I'll say that I've definitely seen something similar in respect to parents who work in or adjacent to the education system. It's almost seems like a higher success rate with their advocacy as well, because they really are attuned to all the systemic nuances. And then on the other hand, it's interesting because, and I've seen this particularly with the Latinx parents that we've interviewed, but not necessarily being sure of what is their jurisdiction, so to speak, as a parent versus what is the jurisdiction of the educators. And there's definitely a little bit of confusion there. And those expectations aren't always put forth honestly or early enough in some cases to the parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they can have like very large, I think that, with the youth, in speaking to the youth, there's always consequences, like that's inevitable, but there's different degrees of confidences or not confidences, consequences. And it goes from, youth being like, I missed out on this opportunity because I didn't know how to apply for a scholarship, for example, to, like bigger consequences, or not to minimize the degree of consequences. But one parent, for example, was talking about how, she is fairly certain that her child is on the spectrum for autism, and the school refused to have him diagnosed, and she didn't speak English. She was a Latinx parent, and she didn't know how she could advocate for her child. And she felt that was affecting him in a very large way. And it's almost everyone that we've talked to has been affected negatively, has had some sort of consequence to not being able to have someone to advocate for them, or to be able to advocate for their children.
And I would even say that in the cases of youth, we've seen that attempts to self-advocate is also unsuccessful. It's interesting to see how when you add the youth or the age factor to it, how those testimonies are taken less seriously and are maybe even penalized more harshly than if it were somebody, or specifically an adult who steps in to advocate for the young people.
Mm-hmm.
I agree, Rhiema, because I know that when I was speaking with parents who have children living with disabilities, it seemed like they're already neglected in the system because of the racism there or the ageism there. But when that level of disability is also involved, they're even more neglected and they're even more stigmatized and ignored within the system, even when the parents know how to advocate for their children or have an advocate there.
So our research doesn't take place in isolation, and it has also been impacted by the global pandemic. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what we've heard from parents and educators, because at this point we had stopped talking to youth, but how COVID-19, how the pandemic, and how all of the factors that come with this global crisis, how has that affected the education of Black and Latinx youth?
It's a real toss-up is what I'm finding, at least. Definitely on the side of the educators, there's a lot more challenges in being able to connect with students. There's a lot more challenges in delivering the curriculum and in engaging students with one another. But on the other hand, I've heard from parents who say that their children are thriving where they would usually be struggling in a classroom environment. So it's a real toss-up for who can really succeed right now. And I guess what that means going forward, how to sort of keep those gains and minimize the consequences for students that are struggling right now.
I think to what you were speaking about earlier, Rhiema, about parents knowing, what's their jurisdiction and what's the teacher's jurisdiction. That line has become more blurred with online learning. Parents are talking a lot about how they, now being in the classroom, quote unquote, with their child, they are sort of realizing what their children are lacking, what attention they're lacking, and they've had to step in and be teacher and parent. And I've had a lot of parents talk about how that's been very difficult for them. And there's a difference. And the difference that you were talking about, who's thriving and who's not thriving, I think is a little bit dependent on what level the parent is able to give.
I think it's from interviewing parents. I've been able to see just again another barrier of having to work, but also having to be engaged with your child and making sure that your child is staying on task and stuff like that. So that barrier is also coming up due to COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. Because which parents are able to be there all day with their children, or able to take a few hours out of their own work day to make sure that their children are on top of learning.
Mm-hmm. Or how it also affects their decision of whether their child does in-person learning or not. Some parents have been like, I have a full-time job and I can't do the online learning. I can't leave my children at home alone all day, and so they've had to do in person, regardless of, I think that sort of outweighs the decision-making process in health and things like that.
So actually, that's interesting how you brought up income being a factor in the children's ability to enroll in online schooling and engage in online schooling, along with parents to support their children through that platform. Because when I was mapping how the newcomer children or refugee children navigate the education system when they land in Canada, a lot of parents are having struggles in doing that because newcomer children, if they haven't experienced online learning before, some school boards are denying them the ability to enroll in online learning and online education.
I think that there's a lot more themes that we could talk about, regarding the education system and the experience of Latinx and Caribbean parents. There's a lot of data there, but I think that for today we're going to wrap up this session. So thank you to everyone on my team for participating, and that's all.